opposition is again criticizing the NDA government, this time not for the farm reforms, but for the other aspect of reforms, the labor reforms. Now, if you've been not living under a rock, you would know that the two reforms and the other set of reforms that have been carried out by the NDA government, that have been passed by the NDA government in the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, they're comparable to the 1991 reforms under Manmohan Singh, under Dr. Manmohan Singh. So if we talk so fondly about the 1991 reforms, why is the opposition today against these reforms in 2020? And I'll come to the criticism of these labor reforms. But first, let me break down the three key labor reform bills that were passed by the Rajya Sabha earlier this week before it was taken up by the Lok Sabha, then it was passed by the Rajya Sabha. The criticisms, the main criticisms, I'll come to those one by one. But the important thing to note here is that over 29 labor laws have been amended and consolidated into 3 labor reforms. So from 29, we've gone to 3. And the benefits and the criticisms, I'll come to those one by one. But firstly, what are these 3 key labor reforms? Firstly is the Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code of 2020, which, as the name suggests, consolidates and amends all the laws regulating the occupational safety, the health and working conditions of the persons employed in the establishment. The second one is the Industrial Relation Code of 2020, which seeks to consolidate and amend the laws relating to trade unions, conditions of employment in the industrial establishments and undertaking, and also the investigation and settlement of any dispute that may arise between the workers or the union and the employer. The third and the most important one is the Code on Social Security of 2020. Now, this will amend and consolidate the laws relating to social security right now and would extend social security to all employees irrespective of the center they are working in or the sector they are working in, be it the organized sector or the unorganized sector. And compare it and consolidate it with the fourth reform, which was announced last year, which was passed last year, was the Code on Wages, which was 2019. And that ensured a timely and a minimum payment to all the workers. So all in all, these 4 key labor reforms, which consolidate more than 29 labor laws, existing labor laws, the historic labor laws, now they are just 4. So what does that mean? What does that mean for the businesses, for these employees, and where is the criticism coming from is what we are going to dig into one by one. Now, the first benefit, of course, both to the employer and the employee of these reforms is that think of someone working in an IT company, in a leading IT company, in a leading IT hub of India. Think of someone working just on a construction site whose employment may be guaranteed today but not tomorrow. These labor reforms, these 4 labor reforms, they want to get these 2 people on the same set of employment benefits. Of course, the nature of the benefits will vary, the quantity of the benefits will vary, but at least the set of benefits can be the same. It's also very helpful for the employer in the sense that right now, if someone wants to start a business, they want to go for a lot of hiring. They want to go for, let's say, firing if they're not having a very good year in the business. If they want to sustain their business, the challenge is to go through such labor reforms, such elaborate labor laws that can also be a sort of a repelling idea for anyone to step into entrepreneurship. And it's also the same case with companies which may be looking to come to India. Since we're talking about getting supply chains from China to India, these labor laws were a hindrance, especially the ones relating to the trade unions and the strikes that we often see. So the first thing it does, it eases the business doing. It eases the atmosphere for doing business in India, for conducting business practices in India, not just for the local people, but also for the companies who might be looking to come in, who knows, from China. The second aspect is it enables employers and other stakeholders in the industry to identify informal workers from the unorganized sector, bring them to the formal fold and secure the long-term commitment to an organization. That is one aspect. Now, I'll give you a very rough example. I have a building construction going on just outside my house. Now, these are people who are daily wagers. They are hired daily or on a weekly basis, paid a small amount, which also is shared with the contract. I'll come to that part later. But they have no long-term commitment to the real estate group they are making the building for. Now, even if this real estate group has been making buildings all over Noida, all over NCR, these workers, they have no long-term commitment to this real estate group. Now, this will change with these labor reforms. Suddenly, there's an incentive for the real estate group to hire workers and secure the long-term commitment, hire them or bring them from the informal fold to the formal fold. That's the second benefit, the long-term benefit. It won't be immediate, but surely long-term. The third benefit is if I talk about the Employers' Provident Fund organization. Now, we have not seen a lot of growth of the Employers' Provident Fund. The number of contributors, it's still somehow stagnant, as various media reports would tell you. But here's an interesting number. Just the casual workers in India, the ones that could be counted, the ones that could be estimated, is around 12.1 crore. And in India, just 20% of the workforce in the organized sector is currently covered in some social security. So at one aspect, you have 12.1 casual workers, which are unorganized sector workers. On the other hand, you have just 20% of the workers in the organized workforce having some form of social security. Now, the labor reforms should change that. The labor reforms, the industry leaders for long, they have been calling for the cutting of costs when it comes to formalization of the entire labor. These labor reforms will aid that. These labor reforms will aid for the security for all the workers, not just in the organized sector, but also in the unorganized sector. So that's the third benefit of these labor reforms. Now, where is the criticism coming from? Where is the major criticism? Now, there are 4 points, if I narrow them down into, from what the opposition has been saying for long. The first criticism is that now the employers can fire up to 300 workers without having to seek the approval from the government. That's the first criticism. Earlier, an employer or a factory unit or a manufacturing unit or a business, the limit was 100 workers. Beyond 100 workers, they had to go for government approval. Now this limit has been raised to 300. So an organization now with up to 300 workers does not need the approval of the government to fire workers. And this is being said would lead to a lot of firing within the industry. Now, this criticism is entirely baseless for one. There's no empirical study to prove that somehow increasing this limit will lead to more firing. All it takes is it takes away the government's approval away. That's all it does. It doesn't take away the benefits that were to be given to the people in case they are being laid off. The notice period will still remain. The wages composition will still remain. The other monetary benefits will still remain. But the only thing that changes is the approval of the government. And as per some media reports, the government only stepped in when they wanted to deny the approval, not when they wanted to approve it. So nothing changes on that front. And perhaps there's no empirical study that suddenly, if an organization can fire more than 100 people, but less than 300 people, they'll go on a firing spree. That's not the case. But here is an interesting story from Rajasthan, which in 2014 did something similar. It allowed companies, since all of this is a concurrent subject, the states also have the power to make laws. The Rajasthan government in 2014, it allowed for firing of workers if they are up to 300 in a certain company against 100. What happened then? A study was conducted and it showed that more factories were coming out of Rajasthan with more than 100 workers in them. And this was one important lesson because of the dwarf ideology a lot of companies in India employ. Now, what is this dwarf ideology? This dwarfinism is basically the companies keeping their employee growth stagnated willingly. Now, talk to any entrepreneur, talk to any boss, talk to any CEO of a business. They would obviously want the employment to grow. The employees grow, the company grows. But this dwarfinism that stuck with the Indian companies was because beyond 100 laborers or workers, they were worried about the labor laws kicking in, which were very elaborate and very complex in nature. So the companies started sticking to this dwarfinism ways of business and the employee growth stagnated. Rajasthan got rid of it, and suddenly against other states, Rajasthan had more factories with more than 100 workers in it. So the hire and fire policy or the criticism of the government really doesn't add up here. But interestingly, it wasn't just Rajasthan. 15 other states have also enhanced the threshold to 300 workers when it comes to seeking government approval before firing. Which are these states? Andhra Pradesh, Arunachal, Assam, Bihar, Goa, Gujarat, Haryana, Himachal, Jharkhand, Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh, Meghalaya, Odisha, Punjab, Rajasthan, and Uttar Pradesh. So 16 states, more than half of the states in India, have already done that. So where is the opposition criticism really coming from? Now, let's move on to the second criticism, which is astonishing in nature. The opposition says that fixed term employment would lead to more hiring and firing. Not just the threshold increase, but also fixed term employment would also result in more hiring and firing. Well, for one, the opposition seems to have forgotten that the unorganized sector, labor, doesn't come with any job security. For them, every new morning is a hiring prospect, and every evening is a fear of being fired. So there's no job security as such. Nevertheless, let's address this criticism. Firstly, it has already been notified by central government and 14 other states. So 14 other states have already gone for the fixed term employment, which include, again, Assam, Bihar, Goa, Gujarat, Himachal, Jharkhand, Karnataka, MP, Odisha, Punjab, Rajasthan, and Uttarakhand. Some of these states have it for specific industries, but mostly 14 states have already notified fixed term employment. Now, the benefits of having a fixed term employment are two. One is the securing the long-term commitment of the workers, which I discussed earlier, giving you the example of the construction workers. The second is currently, assume you're running a factory which makes socks. Now, depending on your production, you may not want to go for a complete laborer. You may not want to go for a 100% capacity when it comes to labor. So you go through a contractual, you go through a contractor. You basically go, what is it called in Hindi, a thekedar. Now that thekedar will also take a share of amount from you, which has to be incurred by the employer. It was also taking money from the employee, the laborers. In this case, the middleman will go. The employers can directly deal with the employees. This is the one major benefit of fixed term employment, that the employers can directly deal with the employees, and on ground, the concept of two employees, first the contractor and then the main employer, that goes away. The opposition, somehow we are not above this middleman syndrome. We saw the same with the farm reforms. Suddenly there was this huge obsession for the middleman in APMC, in the mandis, that the middleman cannot go anywhere. It's the same case here. The fixed term employment will not lead to hire and fire, but will liberate the laborer, the worker in the unorganized sector, from the burden of the contractor with which he was obligated to share a part of his earnings. That changes. Now, this is the second big criticism that has been addressed here. The third criticism is the definition of migrant workers. Now, what was the previous definition of migrant workers under the Interstate Migrant Act of 1979? It said that if a contractor hired a worker from one state, brought him to a different state, only he could declare him as a migrant worker. So until today, migrants had to depend on a contractor to validate themselves as migrant workers, even if they are the ones who've done the entire journey and everything. It was, again, on the mercy of the contractor, who may have his own monopoly in a big city or a certain state. Now, what is the definition of the migrant worker? Well, for one, it has been made possible that the migrant workers who are directly employed by the employers, they classify as migrant workers even if they're coming from different states. Secondly, the migrant worker can declare himself as one by registering on an electronic portal which is seeded with Aadhaar, and no other document will be required apart from Aadhaar. So this entire definition of migrant being changed. The idea is to liberate him from the contractor who gets to decide that if he is a migrant worker or not. And that is the big change here. The last criticism somehow is that women who have been given a more liberal role in these labor reforms, there are far more avenues that have been opened up. The working hours, for instance, in mines have been relaxed. That would compromise the safety of the women. Well, for one, there is an obligation on the employer to have necessary safeguards in place if they're going for women employees. Secondly, no women can be made to work in late hours against their own consent. Again, the state governments, the local agencies, they'll prescribe proper working conditions, proper guidelines where women workers are in bulk, states and mines. and same will go for the children. So this is the criticism which is very unfounded, as it was in the case of farm reforms and before that CAA and Kashmir by the opposition. But it's the same trend every time. Oppose everything that's good for the country or the people and just do it for the sake of politics. Now, with these 4 big labor reforms and the 4 unfounded criticisms that are following them, the government has done one good thing. It has opened up the business sector, the manufacturing sector to the world. Now, the supply chain situation with COVID-19, that has changed, and a lot of companies would be looking to come in India. And this consolidation of all the historic and rather old-fashioned labor laws into 4 new labor laws, that opens up a lot of avenues, a lot of opportunities for companies coming from outside to manufacture in India, and compare it with the production-linked incentive scheme, compare it with the labor reforms. Now, all of these things together come and make possible the ease of doing business, which right now may just exist on paper. But all these little reforms, independent reforms, they come together to ensure that the ease of doing business exists, and this is what the government has been rightfully focusing on. The opposition, if it really wants to criticize, it must come up with some better and some rational criticism of the reforms, which currently they are not unable to find. Thank you.